Blake Stevenson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Prime Minister first announced digital ID, it was to stop illegal working, and it took most of us about a minute to work out that it was total nonsense. Flapping in the wind, the government is now desperately trying to sell the benefits of limiting liberty and freedom for all of our constituents.
Well, the honourable member opposite talks about flapping in the wind. He might have noticed that one person at the moment will be flapping in the wind. That is the Shadow Justice Secretary, who I believe has just been sacked by the Leader of the Opposition for secret plots to defect to the party opposite. I wonder if he wants to ask him if he's flapping in the wind.
John Lamont.
Oh, thank you very much. We don't want digital ID. It's going to cost billions of pounds and it should be scrapped completely. Now, despite...
Well, I think he was lost for a moment there as he was contemplating the implosion of his shadow cabinet once again, which I can wholly understand.
Sarah Perching.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister accept that announcing mandatory digital ID only to then retreat to voluntary digital ID has merely created an expensive, chaotic shambles?
Well, I'm glad the honourable member opposite is smiling about the potential new colleague that she may have obtained in the coming days. We on these benches have a proud history of building public goods that help us to serve people better. The NHS, social housing, the welfare state.
The moment selected for the opening is not explosive in volume, but it is devastating in consequence. Between 0:20 and 0:39, the exchange inside the chamber undergoes a sudden transformation. What began as a policy disagreement is abruptly converted into a personal and institutional ambush. This is the exact point where power stops being exercised through argument and starts being wielded through humiliation. In any serious accountability analysis, this is where everything changes. Up until this point, the discussion is nominally about digital identity, a policy with enormous civil liberty implications. One speaker has raised a substantive concern that the government's stated justification for the system does not withstand scrutiny. Whether one agrees or not, the framework is still parliamentary debate. It is adversarial, but it is legitimate. Arguments are being exchanged. Authority is being tested through reasoning. Then, at 0:20, Josh Simons intervenes. What he does is subtle, but devastating. Instead of responding to the critique about liberty, cost, or government overreach, he diverts the entire conversation toward an unrelated political scandal inside the opposition. He reframes the debate around who is flapping in the wind. This is not rhetorical flourish. This is a deliberate shift of power. In accountability terms, this is what institutional deflection looks like. When a government minister or official is under pressure, the highest risk moment is not when they are openly hostile. It is when they stop engaging with the substance of the challenge altogether. That is the point where systems of power stop being about truth or justification and start being about dominance. By invoking an alleged sacking and secret plots, Simons introduces a narrative that is emotionally charged, destabilizing, and impossible for the targeted party to meaningfully respond to in that moment. It is a classic technique of control. Overwhelm the environment with a different crisis so the original question evaporates. From a legal psychology perspective, this is remarkably similar to how street-level authority misuse begins. When an officer is challenged about the basis for a stop, and instead of articulating reasonable suspicion, they accuse the citizen of being suspicious, hostile, or acting strange, the same pattern appears. The substantive justification disappears. The power shift takes over. Inside this chamber, that shift happens in under 20 seconds. Simons does not merely deflect. He personalizes. He names an individual. He invokes loyalty, betrayal, and internal collapse. That instantly changes the emotional stakes of the room. The audience is no longer thinking about digital ID or civil liberties. They are being invited to watch a political execution. This is how authority protects itself. Once the focus moves from policy to personality, accountability becomes almost impossible. The person being challenged is no longer the government minister defending a controversial program. He is now the commentator on the opposition's alleged dysfunction. He becomes the narrator instead of the subject. This is the precise moment when institutional power flips. And it works. Immediately after this intervention, the chamber does not return to the original topic. The tone has been poisoned. Even when John Lamont attempts to steer the discussion back to the cost and viability of digital ID, Simons again responds not with evidence, not with numbers, not with legal justification, but with mockery about the implosion of the shadow cabinet. The behaviour pattern has now locked in. From an accountability standpoint, this is catastrophic, because once ridicule replaces reasoning, there is no longer a functional check on power. What makes this moment so important is not that it is rude. It is that it is strategically effective. The minister has successfully avoided answering for a policy that affects millions by reframing the debate as political theatre. That is not accidental. It is institutional survival instinct in action. The psychological mechanism is well known: cognitive overload. When an authority figure introduces a new crisis into an already tense environment, it splits attention. The public cannot hold two narratives at once. One of them will be dropped. And it is almost always the one that requires careful, technical scrutiny. In this case, the legal and financial implications of digital ID. This is the same reason bodycam footage often shows officers escalating a stop into an arrest. Once someone is being accused of something emotionally charged, disrespect, hostility, disorder, the original legal basis for the encounter fades into irrelevance. Power has taken over. The parliamentary setting does not change the mechanics. It merely disguises them. By the time Sarah Poaching speaks at 1:02, the environment has already been destabilised. Even though she attempts to return to substance, pointing out the government's flip-flop between mandatory and voluntary digital ID, the tone has been set. The authority figure is no longer on the defensive. He is performing dominance. And he continues to do so. Rather than engaging with the critique about chaos, cost, or public trust, Simons again pivots to insinuations about political alliances and personal advantage. The message is clear. This chamber is no longer a place for rational evaluation of state power. It is a place where power performs itself. This is why the 020 to 039 clip is the correct opening. It captures the exact instant when accountability collapses. Not because anyone raised their voice, but because the rules of engagement were quietly abandoned. This is what institutional failure looks like in its earliest form. Not brutality. Not shouting. Not overt abuse. Just a calm, confident decision to stop answering the question, and to replace it with something that cannot be challenged. That is the moment that everything that follows is built on. Because once power learns that it can escape scrutiny by shifting the narrative, it will do so again and again, in Parliament, on the street, and in every system that is supposed to hold it accountable. Once the narrative has been forcibly redirected, the damage is not confined to a single exchange. It spreads. From this point onward, every interaction inside the chamber is shaped by the power shift that occurred in the opening clip. The authority figure no longer needs to justify. He only needs to perform. This is exactly what happens. When John Lamont speaks next, he attempts to reassert the original frame. He raises two specific objections: cost and principle. Digital ID will cost billions, and it should be scrapped. This is a classic accountability move. It grounds the debate in tangible public harm, taxpayer money and civil liberty. In any functioning oversight system, this would force the minister to produce data, projections, or legal rationale. Instead, Simons deploys the same tactic again, this time with greater confidence. He mocks. He reframes. He invokes internal opposition chaos. Notice what is missing: numbers, feasibility studies, risk assessments, or legal justification. None are offered. Not because they do not exist, but because the environment no longer requires them. The minister has successfully demonstrated that he can escape scrutiny by keeping the chamber emotionally destabilized. This is the institutional version of procedural drift. When authority figures discover that rules are no longer being enforced, they stop complying with them. The question of digital identity is not small. It touches on privacy, movement, employment, and state surveillance. It determines who gets to exist in public systems and who does not. Yet here, it is being brushed aside with jokes about party implosions. That contrast is not an accident. It is the result of a power structure that has learned how to avoid being held to account. The psychology is identical to what we see in misuse of authority cases caught on bodycam. Once an officer realizes they can avoid articulating reasonable suspicion by changing the subject to attitude or tone, the law ceases to be the controlling factor. Behavior becomes the weapon. Here, the weapon is ridicule. Sarah Poaching's intervention exposes just how fragile the government's position actually is. She points out the reversal, from mandatory to voluntary, and describes the result as chaotic and expensive. That is a devastating critique in bureaucratic terms. It suggests a lack of planning, a lack of legal clarity, and a lack of operational readiness. Those are the exact conditions that lead to rights violations. If a system is unclear, enforcement becomes discretionary. If enforcement becomes discretionary, abuse becomes inevitable. And yet, even here, Simons does not engage with any of it. Instead, he again pivots to political theatre. He speaks of smiles, new colleagues, and internal alliances. He wraps himself in the language of public goods, the NHS, social housing, the welfare state, without ever explaining how digital ID fits into any of it. This is not persuasion. It is authority laundering. By invoking trusted institutions, he borrows their legitimacy while avoiding scrutiny of the actual policy on the table. It creates the illusion of moral high ground without the burden of evidence. This is a dangerous pattern. In any accountability system, legitimacy must be earned through transparency and justification. When it is instead inherited through association and rhetoric, power becomes insulated. It stops being answerable to the people it governs. What makes this exchange so revealing is how little effort it takes.
No shouting, no threats, no procedural violations.
Just a quiet refusal to answer, and a confident assumption that no one can force you to. That is the core failure on display. By the time this segment ends, the government has not explained how digital ID will work, how much it will cost, what legal safeguards exist, or how civil liberties will be protected. But it has successfully made the opposition look unstable, distracted, and divided. And in power dynamics, perception is often more important than truth. This is why systems fail. They do not collapse when someone breaks the rules. They collapse when no one insists the rules be followed. In this chamber, the rules of accountability were abandoned the moment the minister decided that ridicule was a sufficient substitute for explanation, and no one was able to stop him. By the final phase of this exchange, the transformation is complete. What remains in the chamber no longer resembles a policy debate at all. It has become something far more revealing, a live demonstration of how institutional power maintains itself when it no longer needs to justify its actions. The most important thing to understand is that nothing dramatic had to happen for this breakdown to occur. No rules were suspended. No one was physically removed. No formal authority was overtly abused. And yet, accountability vanished just as completely as if it had been. This is the modern face of institutional failure. When Simons invokes the legacy of public goods, the NHS, social housing, the welfare state, he is not responding to any of the criticisms raised. He is instead performing a ritual of legitimacy. These are sacred institutions in British political culture. By aligning himself with them, he signals virtue and continuity, even as he avoids scrutiny of a policy that could radically alter the relationship between the state and the individual. This is how power shields itself, by draping controversial actions in the symbols of past good. The digital ID system being discussed is not a trivial administrative tool. It determines how people prove who they are, how they access work, how they interact with the state. It is infrastructure of control. Once in place, it becomes the gateway through which rights are exercised or denied. That is why the earlier shift away from substance was so consequential. When John Lamont and Sarah Poaching attempted to raise concerns about cost, chaos, and retreat from mandatory enforcement, they were doing what oversight bodies are meant to do. They were testing whether the government had met the threshold for imposing a system that touches every citizen's life. But the threshold was never answered. Instead, the government demonstrated something far more powerful, that it did not have to answer. This is where the parallels to body cam footage become unmistakable. In misuse of authority cases, the most dangerous officer is not the one who shouts. It is the one who speaks calmly while ignoring the legal basis for their actions. When a citizen asks, "Why am I being detained?" and the officer replies with commentary about attitude or tone instead of reasonable suspicion, the law has been displaced by authority. The same displacement happens here. Policy questions are met with political theatre. Legal and financial scrutiny is met with insinuations and narrative control. The result is the same. Those in power decide what matters, and those challenging them are rendered irrelevant. This is not simply rude. It is structurally corrosive. Democratic systems rely on the idea that those who wield power must be able to explain it. Not rhetorically, not emotionally, but factually and legally. When that requirement disappears, what remains is not governance, it is management. Management of perception. Management of dissent. Management of narrative. The chamber in this clip becomes a stage for exactly that. And because the authority figure is skilled, composed, and institutionally protected, the tactic works. There is no procedural mechanism in this moment to force him back to the subject. No one can compel him to produce numbers, safeguards, or justifications. The system assumes good faith, and that assumption is being exploited. This is how rights are lost in modern democracies. Not through coups, but through drift. Each time a policy escapes scrutiny through distraction, a precedent is set. Each time that precedent goes unchallenged, it becomes normal. Eventually, it becomes invisible. Digital ID may or may not be implemented, but the method used here to protect it from examination is what truly matters. It shows that the machinery of accountability can be bypassed without breaking a single rule, if those in power are confident that no one will insist on answers. That is the lesson this clip reveals. The opening moment was not a joke. It was a pivot point. From that second onward, the government was no longer being questioned. It was performing. And when institutions perform instead of explain, citizens lose the only real protection they have, the ability to demand reasons before power is exercised over them. This is not about personalities. It is about structure. And the structure, in this exchange, failed.